7 days, 5 contests, 14 global records shattered, 1 MVP title claimed. That is the exact summary of what Caitlin Clark delivered at the FIBA World Cup qualifying tournament in Puerto Rico, and she did it returning from an 8-month absence from competitive play. Meanwhile, somewhere off to the side of all this history being made, A'ja Wilson, the reigning WNBA MVP and Defensive Player of the Year, was not just absent from the tournament. She had not even received an invitation to Team USA's training camp. And her response to watching Clark dismantle record books from the sidelines? Genuinely breathtaking. Not in a good way. While Clark was carving her name into international basketball history, Wilson was watching from home and staging a very visible public meltdown. And here is the thing. It is only going to get more uncomfortable for Wilson from here. Just how deep does A'ja Wilson's jealousy of Caitlin Clark actually run? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. 8 months away from competitive basketball does not just affect the body, it rewires everything. Your timing drifts. Your ability to anticipate defensive schemes slows down. That razor-sharp instinct for split-second decisions, the one that separates elite players from everyone else, it dulls. Players who go through that kind of extended layoff almost always follow the same script when they return. Measured minutes, controlled touches, no forcing, no risks. Ease back in. Protect yourself. That is what the history of the sport tells you to do. Caitlin Clark ignored every word of it and proceeded to demolish 5 global records in 19 minutes of playing time. Let us frame the context properly before going further. The FIBA World Cup qualifying tournament held in Puerto Rico was not an exhibition. This was not a preseason tune-up or a casual international friendly. These were structured competitive games against actual national teams with real consequences attached. Clark was stepping into that environment 8 months removed from her last competitive game, and she was not even in the starting 5. Head coach Cheryl Reeves' philosophy had Clark entering as a reserve for the opening matchup against Segal. On the surface, that framing made sense. Limited exposure, reduced pressure, a controlled environment to rediscover her rhythm. That was the plan. Segal had other ideas. They deployed a full-court blitz press that immediately exposed problems in the starting unit. The offense could not function against it. The ball was stopping. Turnovers were accumulating. The team looked rattled and tight. Then Clark stepped off the bench and onto the floor. Within seconds, she was already decoding the press before it could fully activate. She was generating transition windows before Segal's defense had time to retreat and recover. Her passing choices were placing defenders in impossible situations, forcing reads they simply were not equipped to handle in real time. The starting unit had been stuck in damage control against that identical defense. Clark was converting it into a fast break launching pad. In 19 minutes of bench play, she produced 17 points, 12 assists, and 0 turnovers. Not one. Coming off 8 months of rehabilitation. Coming off the bench, let that actually settle before moving forward. Those 12 assists were not simply an impressive box score line. They simultaneously obliterated multiple all-time FIBA records in a single night. She surpassed the record for most assists ever recorded in a Team USA senior national team debut, and that is not the women's record. That is the all-time record, across both men's and women's programs, in the full history of USA basketball. Then she topped the record for most assists in any senior national team debut across every country in FIBA's global history. Every country, every player, every era. Then she claimed the all-time FIBA record for most assists delivered by any bench player, men or women, across the entirety of international basketball history. 3 assists records. One night, 19 minutes off the bench. And that still only accounts for 3 of the 5 records she broke that evening. She was reaching into corners of FIBA's historical database that nobody had ever thought to examine before that game. The crowd inside that arena in Puerto Rico was reacting the way audiences react when they are witnessing something they do not yet have the vocabulary to describe. A pass would happen, a half-beat of stunned silence. Then the building would erupt, because nothing Clark was doing resembled a comeback. It did not look like someone cautiously rediscovering her footing. It looked like someone who had spent 8 months in storage, fully loaded, waiting for the doors to open. And now they were open. 5 games, 7 days. 14 world records, 1 MVP trophy, awarded to the youngest recipient in the tournament's history. Clark did not simply have a strong qualifying tournament. She worked through the record book methodically, adding to her total across 5 consecutive games, almost every single night. Assists records, DBIT records, bench player records, per-game efficiency benchmarks that had never been reached before. By the time the Spain game concluded, USA Basketball had compiled a list of 14 distinct all-time FIBA records, and every single one of them had Clark's name next to it. All of this coming off 8 months of rehabilitation on a compressed 7-day schedule against international-level competition. The MVP selection was not a courtesy gesture. She was the obvious choice, and the youngest player in this tournament's history to receive that recognition. 14 records, 5 victories, 1 trophy. The youngest MVP ever crowned. That is the full picture. Now let us discuss who was not part of it. A'ja Wilson, 3-time WNBP, Olympic gold medalist, one of the most decorated active players in the sport today, was not present at this tournament. Not because of an injury, not because of a scheduling conflict. She was not invited to Team USA's training camp. That is the entire explanation. USA Basketball evaluated their options, assembled their roster decisions, and Wilson's name simply did not make the list. And before the argument surfaces that the entire established roster sat this one out, that is not accurate. Breanna Stewart received an invitation. Nafiessa Collier received an invitation. Both are Olympic gold medalists. Both are active WNBA players. Both ultimately had to decline because of obligations tied to the WNBA collective bargaining agreement process. They had a documented, legitimate reason for being absent. Wilson had no publicly stated reason whatsoever. The basketball world began drawing conclusions quickly. Was this a philosophical shift in how USA Basketball was building rosters going forward? Had something fractured between Wilson and USA Basketball leadership behind closed doors? No definitive answer emerged publicly, but people were clearly connecting dots, particularly given Wilson's very visible behavior toward Clark throughout the previous year. Then, Wilson decided to speak. After Clark was officially crowned FIBA MVP and all 14 records were formally confirmed, Wilson's public statement was essentially this. Clark was fortunate that Wilson had not been present. Read that again carefully. Clark demolishes 14 world records, claims MVP honors as the youngest ever recipient, goes undefeated across 5 games, accomplishes all of it returning from 8 months on the sideline. And Wilson's framing of events is that Clark got lucky because Wilson was not in the building. Here is what that framing entirely ignores. Wilson was not excluded from the tournament itself. She was excluded from the training camp that preceded the tournament by weeks. USA Basketball made that determination before a single game had been played, so this was never about Clark catching a break at Wilson's expense. This was about Wilson not being selected in the first place. And the "lucky I wasn't there" framing only holds any logical weight if you genuinely believe Wilson's presence would have somehow prevented 14 world records and the youngest MVP selection in tournament history. That is a significant claim to make from your living room couch while someone else is actively rewriting the historical record. Clark said nothing in response. She did not need to. The "lucky I wasn't there" comment did not emerge from nowhere. Wilson has been running this pattern since Clark's very first WNBA season, and the timeline is not difficult to follow. When Clark secured her Nike endorsement deal as a rookie, Wilson did not simply note it and move forward. She launched a month-long public campaign questioning Clark's statistics, questioning whether the recognition Clark was receiving was warranted, and essentially questioning the validity of Clark's entire impact on the sport. This was not a single comment or one interview. It was a sustained, coordinated feeling public effort that ran in direct parallel with the shoe deal announcement, and the timing was anything but accidental. Then Clark won Time Magazine's Athlete of the Year. Wilson had commentary ready. Then Clark began securing major speaking platforms and corporate sponsorship agreements at a financial scale Wilson was not operating at, and Wilson had commentary ready for that too. Every single instance of Clark receiving public recognition triggered a public reaction from Wilson. Every single time. That is not frustration venting in a weak moment. That is an established behavioral pattern. Now let us talk about what Nike is actually doing right now, because this is where the situation becomes genuinely uncomfortable for Wilson. Clark's signature shoe is in development, and Nike is not approaching this as a routine player product release. Reports indicate Nike has restructured internal workspace resources around this project, invested heavily in premium prototype development, and is executing a comprehensive marketing campaign complete with designer collaborations and broad multi-channel brand presence. Nike is treating this launch as a cultural milestone, not a product drop. Wilson's shoe, in the meantime, has been discounted into clearance territory. That is not rhetorical language. That is inventory reality. No active marketing, no campaign presence, no momentum. Nike has essentially redirected the energy, attention, and resources that were previously oriented toward Wilson's line and pointed all of it squarely at Clark. That is a calculated business decision. Businesses do not make those decisions randomly or arbitrarily. The sales data reduces the entire story to 2 sentences. Clark's signature shoe, which has not even officially launched yet, is already projected to sell out within minutes of becoming available. Wilson's shoe has been on the market for months and has not sold through. 2 data points, 1 sentence each. And you immediately understand exactly where each of these players stands with the largest sports brand on the planet. Forbes placed Clark 4th on their most powerful women in sports ranking. Time awarded her Athlete of the Year. Nike is constructing a headquarters-level commercial project around her signature line. None of those outcomes happened by accident. Those are major institutions and corporations responding to television ratings, audience engagement numbers, and concrete market data. The reason Wilson's shoe campaign has gone quiet is not complicated. Organizations pay close attention to behavior. Wilson spent an entire year running a visible public campaign against the sport's single biggest commercial draw. She built a reputation as one of the most caustic presences in the WNBA ecosystem and continued targeting Clark regardless of the consequences. Every time Clark was publicly celebrated, boardrooms observed it. Sponsors noted it. Nike absolutely noted it. Clark sits 4th on Forbes' most powerful women in sports list, while Wilson's shoe collects dust on a markdown rack. That is not coincidence, and it is not misfortune. That is the marketplace communicating its precise assessment of how each of these players has conducted themselves publicly. Following Clark's 5-record debut performance off the bench against Segal, a reporter approached head coach Cheryl Reeve in the post-game press conference and asked her directly to address what Clark had just accomplished. Reeve's response was essentially, "Every player on this team should have the opportunity to shine, not only Caitlin." That was the complete answer. She declined to even say Clark's name when discussing a performance that had just rewritten FIBA history in real time. That clip traveled across every platform within hours, because it did not sound like a coaching response. It sounded like an active deflection. The tension was actually visible on the court during that Puerto Rico game before the press conference became a talking point. Clark was not struggling. Her defensive reads were sharp. Her instincts had not deteriorated. The issue was the system constructed around her was operating at a pace that actively undermined what makes Clark effective. Reeve's foundational philosophy was a democratic offensive model. No single player anchors the system, everyone shares the load proportionally. That framework sounds reasonable in a film session. In practice, it meant Clark was being asked to function inside a structure calibrated for an entirely different tempo and style. Clark's entire game is built on pace. Then Nate Tibbetts stepped in as interim head coach for the Italy game and made 3 immediate decisions. He inserted Clark into the starting lineup. He constructed a 3-guard configuration pairing Clark with Paige Buckers and Kelsey Plum, and then he simply got out of the way and let them play. The Italy game bore no resemblance to what had come before it. Floor spacing materialized immediately. Ball movement was clean and purposeful. The pace was entirely different. Faster, crisper, more intentional. Clark was initiating transition before Italy's defense could establish positioning. Bucas and Plum were filling lanes and rhythm, and the offense had a natural flow to it that the earlier games had completely lacked. Team USA won by 34 points. In the post-game session, Tibbetts stated publicly that the previous approach had been a mistake. Coaches virtually never say that. Standing at a post-game podium and declaring that the prior coaching philosophy was wrong, on camera, on the record, with full attribution, is essentially a public audit of your predecessor's decision-making delivered live. It validated everything that analysts and observers had been arguing since the loss, and that press conference was clipped and redistributed everywhere. New Zealand and Spain received the same blueprint. Clark starting in the 3-guard alignment, fast pace, clean ball movement. By the Spain game, Clark finished with 7 points and 7 assists across 22 minutes, while Kaylee Copper led all scorers with 20 points. And that is precisely what the offense is supposed to produce when a point guard is genuinely running the system. Clark does not need to be the scoring leader for the offense to flow through her hands. The 34-point Italy demolition established that. The Spain performance confirmed it again. The everyone shines equally philosophy survived exactly one coaching transition before being replaced by something that functioned. One lineup adjustment, one decision to start Clark and let her dictate pace. Team USA went from tension-filled post-game press conference